Hi, the purpose of this video is to explain how my school uses warm-up booklets. These are booklets that students keep in the front of their exercise book. We give them a new warm-up booklet at the beginning of every half term, so they have 6 warm-up booklets in a year. And it's essentially just a set of retrieval questions that they answer at the start of every lesson. If I could start by just explaining a bit of context as to why we introduced them. The idea came from, it was a way of dealing with an issue presented by bubbles during COVID times. Many schools, including my own, had to teach our lessons in different corridors during COVID. So, for example, the year 8s were based on the maths corridor, and the year 7s were on the English corridor, and the year 9s were in the humanities corridor, for example. So it was the teachers having to move. And what that meant was that when we arrived at our lesson, the students might have been sitting there for 3 or 4 minutes waiting for us. And we didn't want to arrive to either a room full of students chatting or a room full of students just sitting there in silence, waiting. We wanted to arrive to a room full of students who were already doing maths when we got there. So we introduced these booklets so that they wouldn't have to wait for the teacher to arrive, set up their laptop, log in, get the warm-up or the starter on the screen. We didn't want them to have to wait for all that. We wanted them to be able to start as soon as their previous lesson finished so that they could just get going on maths, and when we got there they were all raring to go, warmed up, done some retrieval practice, and ready to start their maths lesson. So this is something we introduced with great success during COVID times, and we have retained because we think they're really effective for lots of reasons. Now, we know from common sense and from research and from cognitive science, etc., that revisiting previously taught content regularly is a very sensible thing to do. This is an extract from the Ofsted research report into maths. Studies suggest that long-term retrieval of core content should be the focus of teachers and leaders planning. They're saying that retrieval is important, and that might seem like an obvious thing to say, but it hasn't always been kind of something that we've really put much thought into. Certainly in the last maybe 5 years, lots of schools have introduced ways to ensure that students are regularly revisiting previous content in a way that they didn't before. Now, I can confess that about 10 years ago, I didn't really do any retrieval at all. It never really crossed my mind, and it wasn't something we ever talked about in my teacher training or in my school. We never talked about doing regular retrieval with students. And what that meant was you could teach a topic at the beginning of, say, year 10, like, say, SERDS, and then students might revise it for their end of year 10 exams, and then they might revise it for their actual GCSE end of year 11. So they weren't seeing it regularly. They weren't revisiting SERDS all the time. And what that meant was it was a very temporary knowledge. It was knowledge that they would, they'd cram before their exam and they might get it right in their exam. But they didn't have that knowledge really secured in their long-term memory in order to just retrieve it anytime when required. So say, for example, if doing a question where SERDS came up, or if when doing A-level, that knowledge wasn't necessarily as secure and embedded as it should have been, because we didn't really do anything to ensure that happened. Whereas now there's a lot more focus on it, and I think most schools have some kind of retrieval practices in place. My school has kind of 4 elements to the approach we take to retrieval practice. First is that we use warm-up booklets in every lesson. Like I said before, they were introduced for practical reasons during COVID, but they are our most effective tool in ensuring that students regularly retrieve previously taught knowledge. We routinely use them in every lesson. They save us a lot of time in planning because we've got all these warm-up booklets written in advance, so we just have to do some printing, and then every lesson has already got its starter or its do now planned in advance. We have high levels of engagement, which I'll talk about in a minute. There are other ways we do retrieval though. Our end of unit tests, which we call snapshots, they feature retrieval questions. In fact, we like to put retrieval questions in our snapshots that link to things students have been doing in their warm-up booklets, because that helps us to increase engagement in warm-up booklets. So the warm-ups that students do in every lesson, they know they're going to be tested on that stuff soon. So it really helps, like I say, to increase engagement. But yes, we do retrieval in our end of unit tests as well as in our warm-up booklets. We also do some retrieval for homework using, for example, Hegarty Maths inbuilt retrieval tool. And of course, students are retrieving their previously taught maths topics all the time when we interweave topics in our lessons. So for example, if we're teaching solving equations and we put a perimeter question in, then they're retrieving how to work out a perimeter, and that is helping to embed that knowledge in their long-term memory. So there's all kinds of ways that maths teachers can approach this kind of revisiting of previously taught knowledge, and the warm-up booklets are just one of those ways. I'll talk briefly about the design of our warm-up booklets. As you can see, this is a Year 10 one, and you can see on each page there are warm-up 1 and warm-up 2, so there's 2 per page, so it's half a page per day, and those warm-ups consist of normally 3 or 4 questions. We are taking those questions from various sources, like we're using the snipping tool to take things, say for example from CIMT, so we're not writing the questions ourselves. We have now a bank of these warm-up booklets for every year group, so we're not having to rewrite them. We do tweak them a little bit occasionally, but they're basically they're ready to be printed now, so they're not causing us any workload to make them. Something that makes our warm-up booklets a bit perhaps different to other schools is we're not just putting in 3 or 4 random topics every day. There is actually some structure to the topics that we're choosing to put in. During when we were teaching in bubbles in COVID times, we used these warm-up booklets partly for practical reasons to get the students working quickly, but also we were using them to help us fill some lockdown gaps. So for example, say we taught Pythagoras to our students during lockdown. We know that some students won't have attended those lessons or not engaged very well from home, and we wanted to make sure that instead of having to spend weeks reteaching this stuff, we just wanted to make sure we addressed any gaps, and we decided to do it through our warm-up booklets. So for example, we would put a series of warm-ups on Pythagoras in, and that meant that it was an opportunity to do a bit of reteaching, as well as those who had already learnt it during lockdown having that opportunity to revisit it, to embed it in their long-term memory. It was also a good opportunity for those who hadn't engaged in it to actually learn that topic from scratch. Now that's something that we don't need to do so much now because we haven't had a lockdown recently, but we are still going with that same structure of doing kind of 3 topics at a time that then last for maybe 2 weeks. So you can see in these in these warm-ups, I've got some box plot questions, some simultaneous equation questions, and some prime factor tree questions. Now those topics will be in, say, the first 8 warm-ups in the booklet, and then there'll be another 3 topics after that. And what that means is that if a student can't remember how to draw a box plot in that first lesson, then when we go through and correct it, which we do in a lot of detail, then they'll fill in those corrections, and in the next lesson they'll be able to do that box plot because we just went through it the day before. So they're kind of improving. We can see the progress they're making quickly. This is all stuff they've done before, so this isn't teaching all of this stuff from scratch, but it is giving them the opportunity, if they can't remember it, to be reminded and to have some of the key teaching points gone through again, and then the next day they can see their progress they're making, and they can see how their memory and their understanding is building each day. So this is something that is a key feature of our warm-up booklets. So just to show you one more example of how that works, this was a Year 9 warm-up booklet where they have the first warm-up in the booklet has got some rounding, some trigonometry, and some equation solving. The second warm-up has got the same 3 topics. Now, if they couldn't remember, for example, the trigonometry in warm-up 1, then they would have made some good corrections when the teacher went through it in detail. They've got that then fresh in their memory. It's like, yep, I remember doing that last term. The teacher then went through it yesterday, and actually now this is feeling a lot fresher in my mind. And then maybe on warm-up 2, they'll be able to do that one without the support. And then warm-up 3, they've got the same 3 topics again. You can see the equations have gone from x on one side to x on both sides, so there is some progression in difficulty happening there. And then there's warm-up 4, where again we've got rounding, trigonometry, and equation solving, and that will probably continue for another 4 warm-ups of the same topics, and then maybe switch to another 3 topics after that. So we do sort of we don't just randomly fire random topics at students. We do have a bit of thought and progression going on there, and we think carefully about what topics would fit well, and we respond to things that we've noticed students aren't so good at, and we put them in the warm-up booklets to address gaps, and we think this is an approach that works really well. Engagement is really impressive in the way that the students take these seriously. they complete them really well. Here you can see an example of one of my students, and you can see how she has massively engaged in these warm-up booklets. Now obviously this is one of my neatest students, but actually I think if you looked in our books you'd find that the vast majority of our students really complete a lot of the warm-ups every day. They have a good go, they make corrections if they couldn't remember how to do something, they learn a lot from the process. So we think they're really successful and really powerful in helping students to retain information over the long term. This is a really good example here where you can see how a student's marking has made a big difference to their understanding, and in fact this shows really clearly how the way that we do the topic progressions is quite effective, in that we don't just give 3 randomly chosen topics every day. We've thought about the topics we want to put in there, and we've structured the questions carefully so students can improve each day. So what happens is when we go through the solutions, we go through them in detail, so we're not just kind of shoving the answers on the board, which is something I've seen other students do, other teachers do in other schools. We're actually going through each one, sometimes taking answers from the class and doing a bit of cold calling, a bit of discussion, or sometimes it's just me modelling how to do things and they can mark it. But this is a good example because you can see in warm-up 9 at the top left, this student did not know how to work out the volume of the frustum, but in warm-up 10, they have got it right because they would have looked back at warm-up 9, they would have learnt from what they did the day before, they made clear enough corrections that then they were able to improve. This is something that I actually show my students now at the start of every year on. This is how you can improve by making corrections, and it's a valuable lesson for them to learn. This was a year 10 student. You can also see that in the question on error intervals in warm-up 9, they've corrected their symbols, and they didn't correct the number in the middle, which wasn't quite right, but they did correct their symbols, which they then get right in warm-up number 10. So again, they've learnt from their mistake there, and then they've realised that actually they're getting what they're writing in the middle of the inequality incorrect as well, and they've corrected it. So you can see that they're making really powerful corrections here where they're learning. So this is really an effective way for us to address misconceptions and also help students retain information and remember things that they were taught in previous years. So we think that these are really effective tool in our teaching toolkit for a number of reasons. We've had a couple of criticisms of our warm-up booklets, or there are some general criticisms about this kind of thing. One is that people say students don't bother turning up on time because they don't consider the warm-up to be an important part of the lesson, and that's really sad if that is happening in some schools. I have seen it happening. That is not happening at my school at all. We don't have a problem with lateness in maths in the slightest. We don't have students who don't take these seriously and think they're really important. Like, our students really understand, because we talk about it with them in a kind of, you know, sophisticated and grown-up kind of way. We talk about retrieval practice. We talk about how important the warm-ups are for them to do well in their GCSE. Even if, whatever year group they're in, we talk about the long-term impact of not forgetting the stuff they've previously learned. So students take them really seriously. And I think because we also test them on the stuff in the warm-up booklet, in our end-of-unit tests, we have really good engagement, and it's not a problem for us at all. I have seen engagement be really bad in these kinds of mixed topic warm-ups, definitely. I've seen schools use off-the-shelf warm-ups where the students haven't even learnt half the topics on them, and then obviously engagement's poor. Of course it's going to be poor if you're giving students topics to do as a warm-up that they haven't been taught yet. That's not good practice. And the other place where I've seen really bad engagement is where students have been given, say, 10 warm-up questions, and only given a few minutes to do it, and they're nowhere near finished. The teacher hasn't circulated to see how they're getting on. The teacher's just given them a timer, not even checked on their progress, and then when that timer goes off, just put the answers up on the board for a couple of minutes. Students have checked, they haven't done half of them anyway, they've got some of them wrong, and then the teacher's just moved on, so no one's learned anything. So that's not what we do at all. Our students know they're important, our students engage massively in them, and our students do learn from them. So there are things that can go wrong with using this kind of approach, but that's certainly not what's happening at my school. The other response to criticism, or the criticism that we've actually had for our particular warm-up booklets, is that the content doesn't link to the prerequisite skills needed for the lesson. Some people don't like the fact that we are just sort of choosing 3 or 4 random topics which are nothing to do with the actual topics that we're teaching that day. So for example, if I'm teaching solving quadratic equations, perhaps I might want to have a warm-up on factorising or solving linear equations or simplifying expressions or something that actually links to what I'm doing. Now, that is how I used to do starters many years ago, sort of 10 years ago. I always only ever had a sort of warm-up or starter activity that related to the actual lesson. But now, I guess we just do both. So we'll do the warm-up booklet, first 4 minutes of the lesson, then go through it. Everyone's ready, everyone's learnt from it, and then we'll introduce the topic. We'll say, right, today I'm teaching you how to solve a quadratic, for example, and then let's say, right, now let's start with a reminder of how we factorise quadratics that we learnt last year, and we'll do a bit of practice then. So I don't really see why it has to be one or the other. I don't see why we can't do both. And it's not that it's eating into our teaching time, because the prerequisite stuff is part of the teaching. That's not an extra or something that's like, just a starter that's not key to the lesson. So I think that you sort of have to separate these things. There's retrieval, and then there's assessing prerequisites, and they are separate things, and they can and should be treated separately. So absolutely happy with our decision that our topics in the warm-up booklets don't directly link to the skills needed in the lesson, because we think it's good practice to do both. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Just a quick kind of whistle-stop tour through how our warm-up booklets work. I can't share the warm-up booklets because that's not my content. Like I said, we are snipping screenshots from various places, all sorts of websites that provide banks of questions. So they're not mine to share. Our Year 7 ones are all SATs questions. Some of them we're taking from the Maths for Everyone Key Stage 2 section, and some of them we're taking from actual SATs papers. But yeah, all our Year 7 ones are particularly, well, in the first half term, are based on retrieval of Year 6. And then for years 8, 9, 10 and 11, we are just using a whole variety of stuff on topics that we've taught previously, and we're thinking carefully about the topics to put into those. For example, by analysing how students did on the mid-year assessment, that tells us the topics that we need to put in our warm-up booklets for the next term. But yeah, I hope you found that helpful, and do get in touch if you have any questions.